this is the first meeting of the annual conference of the Standing Group of International Relations of the Italian Political Science Association. The first event, it is thought as a roundtable for PhD students on a topic that of revisionism in international relations, that it seems to be very important, and it is characterized by the presence of many persisting voids in the literature. I think that there is a very interesting and a very wide space for new studies, new research, as those that we will present today, within which 4 PhD students, Lorenzo Termine, Flavia Lucenti, Nicolò Fasola, and Carlo Catapano, and with my co-chair, Andrea Carteni of the Sapienza University of Rome, who is also the director of the CEMAS Research Center.
Thank you, Gabriele. Many thanks to all the organizers for this very interesting meeting. So we are talking about topics among the most coolest of the international relations contest and at the present time. So in that sense, I find this workshop out that as it's a very exciting issue. I would like to give the floor to the next speaker.
I will start the discussion from a very realist standpoint, just because I want to highlight how much realism, and in particular power transition theory and neoclassical realism, have failed in dealing with contestation and revisionism. So the first point is that we all know that power transition theory is based on a two-fold approach, which sees power and dissatisfactions as the main drivers behind the rise of a revisionist power. So the theory basically goes like this. Whenever you are rising to the top of the international system hierarchy, and whenever you are dissatisfied with the existing conditions, basically you are expected to mount some kind of challenge, but it's not precisely defined which kind of challenge to the existing conditions, to the status quo. And so starting from this, classical realism, power transition theory, and even neoclassical realism, and I here mention basically Anga Schweller's works, that is not a proper neoclassical realist, at least in the first half of the 90s, in my opinion. But still, PTT, classical realism and neoclassical realism, sees a continuum of postures spanning from the total status quo posture to the radical revolutionary revisionist posture, of course, of the Nazi Germany case. And still, I think that this kind of framework, it fails in telling us something about today's China and probably also today's Russia, but I will leave this kind of argument to my colleagues and friends. I will strictly deal with China. So if we take PTT as the starting point, we know that we need power and dissatisfaction, and I will not dwell too much on what kind of power and what kind of dissatisfaction and how much power and how much dissatisfaction, but we need power and dissatisfaction. But there is a huge theoretical problem when it comes to the Chinese rise and all the literature and the narrative on how much China is rising. And the problem is both theoretical and methodological. So how do we measure dissatisfaction? And this is something that I'm sure Flavia will have something to say about in a moment. Basically, the realist schools are not so much they do not so much agree on how to measure dissatisfaction. So, for example, someone tried to measure dissatisfaction by the diversification of the alliance portfolios. So, if you stick with the status quo power alliance system, then probably you are a status quo power. But if you go and create a new alliance, then probably you are dissatisfied. The problem is what the Latins call the petitio principii. So you try to define a power as revisionist, starting from the fact that it has done something that is revisionist, but you take that something as the evidence of revisionism. So it's a cyclical pattern. So I found out that probably is not the best way to proceed to use alliance portfolio diversification as the measurement of dissatisfaction. And here, what I want to tell is something I will not tell my solution to this kind of intellectual theoretical problem, but I will start from the end. So I will start from the output, that is Chinese foreign policy, and try to put Chinese foreign policy in a very minimal framework to see if it fits with power transition theory and neoclassical realism expectations. So if we start from the end, meaning if we start from the output, Chinese foreign policy, we can see Chinese foreign policy through a five-pronged framework, to a five-pronged prism. And we can divide Chinese foreign defense policy into four arenas, sorry. And the first one is military build-up. So how much do you build up militarily, and so how much do you spend in military resources and assets, and how much are you rising militarily? And the second one is how much do you use that kind of potential, so how much do you use the military instrument, and we can call it the resort to the military instrument. And the third one is territorial expansion. So how much do you spend territorially, and so how many territories do you gain with or without the military instrument? And then last but not least, if you propose, whether you propose new alternatives, regional security institutions or not. And if we look at Chinese foreign policy through this kind of prism, we can see that when it comes to military build-up, China has been rising indeed, so is a rising military power, but has not done it in the radical revolutionary way. If we take the Nazi Germany case as the emblematic case of rising revolutionary challenger. Instead, Chinese military build-up has been kind of gradual and selective, so has been very peaky in some way, and chose some domains of military build-up instead of some others. And even in those domains of power, of military power, sometimes it has opted for gradual, incremental ways of building up. So, for example, nowadays we are still talking of the military, of the US military edge over China and over, of course, all the other powers in the world, including Russia, because China has not been able to convert, or probably has not even been willing to convert, that kind of economic potential, economic resource that we all know into a properly challenging military build-up. And this is my first point. So what about the second point, the resort to the military instrument? And this is even more clarifying. When it comes to how you use the military instrument in serving your foreign policy goals and your national interests, China has been very, very self-restrained in the use of the military instrument, and we can explain it in so many ways, resorting to external factors or to internal factors, but still we know that China has been very worried, very timid, very cautious in using the military instrument to not trigger a military escalation with the neighboring countries. So, for example, the only time, actually, probably the only 2 times that China has employed the military instrument properly was in the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, the third Taiwan Strait crisis, when started firing missiles against Taiwan, and then in 2017 against India in a actually fist fight across the border, so not a gunfight, not a single shotguns was fired in that contest. And then probably the third one is June 2020 during the pandemic crisis last year, again with India in a rather poor bloodshed still at the border. And so if we take power transition, then we should expect China to use increasingly its military instrument to coerce other powers or to impose through brute force its will on over the other powers. And still, this is not the evidence that we see. So, for example, even when facing minor powers like the Philippines or South Korea or Vietnam, still China preferred to use non-military means of coercion or paramilitary means of coercion. So, for example, the Coast Guard or the so-called maritime militia. And this is something that I find very, very insightful on how China perceives its regional status quo and the risk of escalation with the neighboring countries, or probably with the offshore balance there, which is of course the United States. So third one, territorial expansion. And this is really interesting because if we look at territorial expansionism from China, we see that actually in the 90s, China managed to solve dozens of territorial disputes with the neighboring countries through diplomatic engagements. So China benefited very much from the non-bipolar / unipolar new condition in the world, and used its diplomatic engagement to solve many long-standing thorny issues of territorial disputes. But then China has also started doing something else. In particular, at the end of the 2000s and beginning of the 2010s, China started using, as I have already said, the coast guards or non-military ships and vessels to provoke other countries and to kick other countries off many islets and many islands in the South China Sea, and try to do something similar also in the East China Sea. But still, the only territories that has gained are very small and very limited islands and territories in the South China Sea. And this still collides with power transition theory and much of the realist scholarship on rising power and revisionism. Last but not least, when it comes to regional security institution, and so when it comes to how security is managed, according to Patrick Morgan on regional security orders, when it comes to this kind of institutions, China has been very, very eager to join existing institutions sponsored or even created by the United States and its allies in the region in Asia, and has been very active in those institutions, at least until the 2011-2012. Then it has started being skeptical, and it did not decide to leave the institution, but it started to begin very skeptical on the efficiency and the nature and the objective of this institution, and started to see the United States as a offshore hegemon trying to redirect the institution in an anti-China way. But still, it was not until 2014 that China proposed a new institution, that is the new Asian security concept, which is not a proper institution. It's more like a vision for the region. But 2 years later, this proposal was de facto shelved. So we heard nothing about the NASC, so the proposal later on and in the following years. So we can assume that the proposal was de facto dropped by China. And this is interesting because if you look at regional security institutions, there is the highest level of self-restraining. And still, I want to add something about alliance, and then I will try to sum my comment up. When it comes to alliance, China has been really self-restraining and really minimalistic. Because if you look closely, China has not been allying with anyone except for North Korea in 2001, when they renewed their alliance for the 50 years anniversary of the alliance, but was really a more ceremonial procedure rather than a military thing. And we all know that the relationship is really unbalanced. So China is not siding with strong countries, and it's not siding with the other revisionist countries, probably because there are not other revisionist countries in the region except for North Korea. So to sum it up, if we start from power transition theory and neoclassical realism, at least in the Randall-Schweller way, we should expect China to be our radical, revolutionary, rising challenger. And still, this is not the case. So if we start from the end, from the output, we see that in many domains of power, and I limited myself to those domain of powers, those material domains of power regarding security and military, in the military domain. When it comes to those domains, we can see that even if it was rising economically, it didn't opt for radical ways, radical strategies, radical instruments of national power. And I think this is something that we should, as PhD students and more generally IR students, we should focus on. And I think it's the really interesting thing about Chinese foreign policy. And this is it. I don't want to waste other time. And thank you for the attention to everyone.
Okay, so today I would like to discuss with you about basically what we meant by, contestation and contestant in international order, trying to introduce into the case of Russia. Even if in my PhD dissertation, I look at the case of Russia and the case of China, but for today, I prefer to just focus on the case of China. Well, trying to unpack the concept of contestation, the first thing to say is that a huge literature actually exists speaking about contestation and IF theory, and it's practically impossible to be summarized in just 10-minute talks. But what I would like to stress is that, in my opinion, when we speak about contestation and liberal international order, we are addressing to a type of contestation that mainly involves contesting and disputing the values that are at the base of the current international order, and also the institution and practices on which that are created on the base of these founding values. And this is an approach that I share in my thesis, and that is an approach that, of course, is very compatible with the constructivist paradigm of the the constructivist paradigm of the IR theory, and also with the English school approach. Well, it leads me to the fact to the question about who are the today contestants of the current international order. Well, according to mainstream approach, rising power above others, China and Russia, are the main contestants of the current international order because they are non-Western and illiberal states. But I will add, not only them. And indeed, in very recent time, we are also assisting to a type of contestation that is carried out by the same states, namely Western states that have invested in such rule-based order. So according to my research finding, coming back to the case of China-Russian, contestants are mainly dissatisfied power. So the main point of my dissertation is that China and Russia are actors that socially represent themselves as great power, but they suffer from a sort of missing social recognition of the status of great power, mainly by what I define in my dissertation as the relevant others, namely the Western country. So the main point is that this missing social recognition as a great power at the international waters level caused the dissatisfaction of China and Russia and pushed them to contest first of all, the United States-led West, but more broadly also the liberal international order, because this is mostly perceived as necessary just to maintain the dominance of the US-led West. So basically the point is that dissatisfaction is a triggering factor for contestation. Looking at the case of Russia and trying to understanding the dissatisfaction of Russian, what we would like to see is that, Russian basically have experienced dissatisfaction, and it's a sort of a way also for measuring dissatisfaction, coming back to the presentation of Lorenzo. Every time it has perceived that their self-perception as major power has been questioned mainly by the West. Indeed, it encouraged Russia to react against what it can be defined as a situation of status immobility. Namely a situation in which the states perceive that I obtain a sort of structural injustice, which seems now to them impossible to be reversed. And this is encouraged, as Stephen Ward writes, their response that bring them to protest and legitimated the foundation of the status quo order. So the attempt on somehow measuring this kind of dissatisfaction, I trace three main situations that in which we can recognize that Russia dissatisfaction increased. The first one is when the West almost unilaterally manage international crisis because it boosts Russian awareness of being treated as a secondary power, and it mostly concede with all the time that Russian perceived that his status and his role as veto member at the United Nations Security Council was not fully respected by the West, and it's something that happened in different situation, but above other during the Balkan Wars because of the operational light force that ignored the double veto of China and Russia, and more recently in the attempt of managing the Libyan civil war, as given the the endangering the very difficult situation that was recorded about human rights during the civil war. Basically, the United States, together with France and the UK, forced the interpretation of the resolution 1973 and evoked the responsibility to protect to military intervention in Libya for shielding civilians. The second situation are the Western interference. What Russia perceived is have been Western interference in its sphere of interest that mostly coincide with the region of the post-Soviet space. In that case, probably the most outstanding case is that of the Color Revolution that Russians say that has been orchestrated by the West for encouraging the spread of democratic regime and make Russia basically weaker in the region. So to weaken Russian influence in the post-Soviet space. And third, and I would like to focus on this third point indeed, because I think that it passed quietly among scholars of IR and Russian foreign politics. I traced that Russian dissatisfaction drastically increased every time that Russia has been reproached by the West, and it includes public reproachments, but also sanction, as this posture of the West would undermine the reputation of Russia as a reliable actor on the international scene while promoting public profile of Russia as the destabilizing actor. And so Russia dissatisfaction, as I said before, increase every time that you feel of being reproached by the West. And it's something that Russian considered happen systematically. Indeed, Russia today speaks of sort of Russophobia that is a very recurrent topic in the Russian narrative. In this slide, I collect some pictures that symbolize one of the main moments in which Russia felt that its image as great powers, major powers, be injured by the West. First of all, we have the release of the movie, The Leviathan, that was released indeed during the Ukrainian crisis. And it's a movie that returned a very negative image of Russia as a country affected by a disrupting alcoholism, political corruption, and also that returned a very negative image of Russian church. And the fact is that this movie gained great attention, great notice from the Western public, and also prizes. So it made Russia very annoyed about all the resonance that it had in the West. And several times Russia released, well, the Kremlin released some statement by saying that this is a movie just loaded with anti-Russian stereotypes, with the scope of depicting an image of Russia as the bad guy in the middle of the Ukrainian crisis. Another occurrence was narrated a fact that happened shortly after in February 2015, and was the murder of the leader of the opposition, Boris Nemtsov. When the morning after this murder, the front pages of many Western newspapers titled with some heater insinuating Putin's involvement in his murder. And some of them also compared Nemtsov's murder with the one in 2006 of the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, suggesting therefore a sort of Kremlin involvement in both the murders. So all these accusations, of course, were dismissed by Russia as the Kremlin considered them as pure provocation without pieces of evidence, just for damaging the public image of Russia and that of its president. And the same was said also about the charges that were moved against Russia for the poisoning of the agent Skripal. But this perception will be discredited, curiously, also occurred more recently regarding the release of the TV series produced in 2019 by HBO, titled Chernobyl, that Russia comment as a mere falsification for discredit its past and to injure its present. And to give you a measure about how Russia care about the release of this series, this American series, it seems now that Russia is producing a known version of the series Chernobyl, and rumor says that this time will be an American spy to be responsible for the explosion of the plant. More recently, as I think everybody heard, we have seen also an increase of tension about the case of Navalny, to which Russia basically overreacted. Indeed, we heard the statement released by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that said that it was ready to cut ties with Europe and in general with the West in case of additional sanction that that can be caused by the case of Navalny. And it's another important episode that says us how much Russia care about maintaining a good reputation at international level. So I mentioned here other events that can be, that can contribute to develop this perception of Russia to be systematically discredited by the West. But I just would like to conclude and leave space for a question, I hope, by saying that the point of my talk is that yes, that having a good reputation is important for Russia to protect its self-representation as a great power. And every time that Russian perceived that is not recognized, socially recognized as a great power, it made of Russia, it made Russia a dissatisfied actor, and it makes Russia susceptible of contesting not just the Western leadership, but also to contest today's liberal international order. Thank you.
Now, my PhD research actually doesn't deal with this very topic, dissatisfaction and revanchism and revisionism as such. I deal mostly with Russia's military doctrine and strategic decision making, but still, I feel like I can say something about the topic too. And actually, Flavia's presentation is a very good background for my own presentation, in as much as I'm too concerned with inter alia Russia's self-representation. And in fact, my work is framed by a constructionist or constructivist, rather theoretical approach. And in particular, I argue that states do not exist out of the minds of people or leaders, more appropriately. That is, what one calls state policy, for example, Russia's foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy, and so on and so forth, that is nothing else than the complex outcome of a series of choices and decisions which have been taken by the ruling elite of the specific state, if you want. And in turn, there is no leader, there is no member of any state's elites, which is culture-free or preconception-free. But rather each and every member of each and every elite on this planet is a subject whose decisions are guided by a peculiar way of thinking, which is embedded in the cognitive frames of that very people, and which results of successive steps of socialization. And when it comes to grand strategic and even military doctrinal decision making, that way of thinking, which is internalized by a socialization, can be called strategic culture. Personally, I define, on the basis of the literature, a strategic culture as the dominant set of beliefs concerning security policy and the use or threat of use of force, which is held by a state's elite. Now, the military doctrinal side of strategic culture is of no relevance to our discussion here, even though it would be nice to discuss about that aspect as well. What is relevant here is rather the more politico-strategic component of a strategic culture, which embeds, in my theorization, beliefs regarding a state's self-perception and worldviews. This, of course, is valid for strategic culture in general and for Russia in the specific case. That is, by defining Russia's self-perception, ontology, and by defining Russia's understanding of all things international, meaning how the world works, strategic cultural beliefs, strategic culture set Russian preferences and lines of actions, including in terms of contestation of the United States-led liberal international order. Now, in order to understand what are Russia's peculiar self-perception and worldviews, and to what extent this self-perception and worldview clash with the liberal international order, I analyze the case studies of Ukraine and Syria. Now, given time constraints, I will not offer any fine-grained analysis of Russia's discourse and practice in and around Syria and Ukraine. I will just catch some of the main findings, which in my opinion are worth highlighting. First of all, the main and major finding in terms of Russia's strategic culture, indeed in terms of Russia's self-perception, is that Russia defines its deepest ontology, defines a social community of reference as an ascriptive community. An ascriptive community, an ascriptive social community, is a community whose defining features are given, non-negotiable, and fixed. And they are mostly language, culture, religion, and civilian. Now, being given a non-negotiable the elements of such ascriptive communities, the Russian ascriptive community becomes a conservative community, which means it cannot expand, but it cannot even shrink from its original dimensions. Of course, now here the trick in terms of Russian self-perception is that Russia's self-perception ontology, the Russian community of reference, exceeds the formal borders of the Russian Federation to include a wider geographical space, which is that, of course, of the Ruski Mir, the space of the former Soviet Union, basically, which is accommodated by those same fundamental given and unchangeable principles. Now, this narrative emerges clearly from the case of Ukraine, emerges less clearly only implicitly in the case of Syria, in Russia's discourse around Syria, but stands there on the background and basically ultimately justifies and legitimizes Russia's claims to great powerness and Russia's claims to be a worthy member of the international community. What is important in our discussion to underline that this conservative ascriptive community of reference with which Russia self-identifies is totally at odds with the liberal ontology instead. The liberal ontology, which is underpinned by the international order, which is supported by the United States, in as much as a liberal ontology, by definition, is transformative and aims at normative level to expand it universally in time and space. Therefore, when engaged in its effort at universal expansion, the liberal ontology at some point will necessarily come and touch the borders of the Russian ascriptive community, and therefore tensions will arise. Second element, which I would like to underline, is regards Russia's perception of a fundamental dimension of international life, which is the normative dimension, the legal normative dimension. Russia seems kind of fixated with formal procedures and legal norms, in particular those of sovereignty and non-intervention. Norms which nonetheless, at the end of the day, are interpreted or put into practice in a sort of dualist way. Especially when it comes to the application and validation of the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention. Because on the one hand, Russia at the very general level stands strictly and strongly in defense of the universal value of the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention. And this is clearly rendered clearly by Russia's actions and talks around Syria. But on the other hand, Russia totally disregards those principles within the so-called, I would say, geo-ideational space of the Ruski Mir, which is the space which is the space of Russia's social ontology. Because there, given that Russia perceives itself as the center of that very social community, the other elements belonging to the Ruski Mir are basically ultimately deprived of subjectivity and therefore of the right of sovereignty. While on the other hand, Russia, being the deus ex in that area, has the right to override basically those ultimate principles. Now, one of the problems here lies with the fact that such dualism, such dualistic application of the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention is not admitted by the liberal international order, which instead predicates the universal validity of the ordering principles of sovereignty and non-intervention, and introduces, of course, an exception to such universal validity, which is the exception of violation of human rights, which is the right to the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention are suspended in front of flagrant violations of human rights or democratic standards. Of course, this is an argument which is not accepted by Russia, again, basing its own reasoning on the self-identification as an ascriptive community with specific and very different values and cultures with respect to the West. Therefore, we see here that the lines of actions predicated by the liberal thinking and by Russian thinking do not touch each other. I would then make a final observation, a final reflection in regard to another aspect which characterizes Russia's framing of the Ukraine and the Syrian crisis, which deals with color revolutions, which were already mentioned by Flavia. Indeed, the Russian narrative around Ukraine and Syria in those terms is basically identical. Both crises are framed by Russia as examples of color revolutions, as examples of the Western US-led geopolitical engineering, social institutional engineering, and ultimately Western evil deeds, Russians would say. Put differently, color revolutions in Russian eyes are sort of mechanisms for expanding the liberal regime type and transform and include a progressively higher number of communities within the remit of the liberal space, communities which were not liberal originally, maybe, and which therefore see themselves deprivated of their own original subjectivity. Now, again, starting from Russia's Russia's self-perception, ascriptive reasoning, this becomes quite a nightmare. So, taking stock of these observations and boiling down the discussion to Russia's approach towards the US-led liberal international order, I would say that in my opinion, Russia does not argue much against the US-led part of the liberal international order, but argues more against the liberal component of such international order. A liberal component which clashes not just with Russia's own ontology, but also negatively affects, according to Russia, the orderly nature of the order itself. In as much as, again, the West is seen as implementing this sort of revolutionary attempts via color revolutions, indeed. And it's interesting to notice, indeed, that the US, of course, are disliked in as much as they are a liberal power, but they are kind of respected as a great power themselves. Many times Russia points out that the United States are a peer. Of course, in doing so, Russia basically gratifies itself, puts itself at the levels of the great power par excellence, and thereby kind of tries to assert its own great powerness. So the United States are oftentimes pointed out as referred to by Russia as great powers, legitimate great powers. Somehow Russia more than once in various conflict scenarios has advocated for the sharing of the burden or the responsibility for giving order to the world. And Russia indeed has oftentimes put into practice what a scholar, Meteskak, has defined as copycat behavior vis-a-vis the practices and intentions of the United States. The flagrant example of this is the Syrian context, where we can see the Astana process implemented by Russia as a sort of reproposition or symbolic appropriation of what the United States did at Dayton and Camp David during the apex of the unipolar moment. So my idea, my opinion is that Russia is not much against the US-led part of this international order, but more about the liberal component of it, the liberal essence of it. Now, here there are, of course, two problems. The first problem being, is it possible to separate US leadership and liberal imprint? No, it's not possible. So therefore, even if theoretically speaking, there is such differentiation in the revisionist approach of Russia to the current order, de facto, such differentiation doesn't have much of a sense in practical terms. The second problem or critical aspect that I would like to underline as a conclusion is that, well, from what I've said so far, it emerges clearly that the ultimate reason of Russia's dissatisfaction with the US-led liberal international order the ultimate reason lies in Russia's own self-perception as a definite separate community with its own culture and values, which must remain and must not be transformed by external interferences. And from Russia's rhetoric, it seems quite credible that such solid identity, such solid social community exists. But however, if we look below the surface, and if we close up, if we try to have give a closer reading to the, how to say, complexion of Russia's society, we clearly understand that this idea of a solid transnational Russian Slavic identity is quite shaky indeed. Russia itself has been struggling greatly to make sense of its own subjectivity. So overall, if Russia's own self-perception in social terms is the ultimate reason of why Russia opposes the US-led international order, then the grounds of, at the end of the day, the grounds of such opposition are very shaky themselves.
Okay, so as much as for Nicolò, my research topic is not directly related to the issue of the international order and the state and future of the international order, but I think that, well, the topic is, as you can see from the title, the relationship between China and Latin America. And well, I think this topic is somehow related to the debate about the future of the international order. And I think, and I will try to do that today, this case can yield useful insights also for the topic of US-China competition and the US-led international order. So I would like to make a really quick premise before starting, and it is about why I look at Latin America and why I think it is interesting, although particularly here in Europe is an understudied topic and is often overlooked. Well, I think for the case is relevant for two reasons. And the first one is that the relationship between China and Latin America is an absolute novelty, is something that pertains basically to the 21st century. And before the turn of the century, China and Latin America had really minimal, if not irrelevant, relations. So in a way, I think China's growing ties with Latin America is a good way to measure and evaluate China's expanding influence and growing capacity to project its power and influence throughout the globe. And the second reason is the fact that for both historical and geographical reasons, Latin America has always been considered as part of the United States, I would say, sphere of influence. And in the United States as well, you can hear a lot about the concept of backyard, or el patio trasero in Spanish, when referring to Latin America. But I think that for this reason, having China competing, or anyway being present and growing more and more influent in the region, is in itself an important evolution and an important transformation that signal the transformation that are occurring at the international level. So once say that, I will like here really, really quickly to present an overview of the topic, to give you an idea of what we are talking about when we talk about China and Latin America. Here I have reported some key dates of the relationship that I think describe quite well the evolution and the speed of the evolution of the relationship between China and Latin America. For reasons of time, I cannot go through all the dates, but I just want to signal that I have started from 2004, from Hu Jintao's visit to Latin America, which was the first real attempt by a Chinese president to engage with Latin America. And in less than 15 years, you can see already in 2017, Latin America has been included in what is the most important global initiative presented by China, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. Or you can see several Latin American countries joining the main financial institution set up by China, which is the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And I think this is a good sign and a good evidence of how the relationship has evolved rapidly in less than 2 decades. And the other point is that I would like to make is to highlight how relations between China and Latin America look like at the moment after this 2 decades long process. So again, I just want to mention some points here. And of course, I'm talking about Latin America as a whole, but of course, that many distinctions will be necessary to understand all the differences between the different sub-regions or the specific countries of the region. And so, for example, I would like to mention the commercial dimension because it has been the main and first driver of the convergence between China and Latin America, and particularly in this case, South America. China has become the largest trade partner for South America in less than 15 years. And to give you an idea, in 2000, the value of the bilateral exchange between China and the region was below 9 billions per year, while in 2010, this figure had already jumped to over 130 billions. And in 2019, it had jumped to over 215 billions. So to give you an idea of the magnitude of the process we are talking about. And another point relates to the recognition by Beijing of 7 South American and including also Mexico, as comprehensive strategic partners, which is the highest status that Beijing recognized to foreign countries. And I think this is another important testimony of how extensive and how deep the partnership between China and the region has become beyond trade itself and investments. China now consider Latin American countries as partners for their cooperation on many different levels, at the political, but also at the military and also the security level. So, and the last point for this is this thing that 3 countries in Central America, Panama, Dominican Republic, and El Salvador, has reached recognition over the last 2 decades from Taiwan to Beijing. And I think this is another important detail, because in the early 2000s, when China was approaching the region, basically 12 out of the 20 countries that were still recognized in Taiwan were located in the Western Hemisphere in Latin America. So one of the goals that China had in approaching the region was to promote its one China policy, and it had a partial success on that point. So after that, I would also like to try to put China's presence in Latin America in perspective, because the advancement I have been citing are, I think, relevant and demonstrate that China should be considered today as a relevant and influent player in Latin America. But it should also be mentioned that China's capacity to engage the region is lacking on several dimensions. For example, at the military level, and I think this point relates to also what Lorenzo was saying before, China has basically no physical military presence in the region, no military outposts in the region, and it is still a minor partner in military terms for most South American and Latin American countries, with, of course, some relevant exceptions, like, for example, Venezuela or Bolivia. But if you look at the whole region, the United States is still the reference point for most countries in Latin America. And also in investment, we hear a lot about Chinese investments in Latin America. And as I was pointing out before, China, through its policy banks, has invested more than 130 billions in the last 15 years. But if compared to, for example, US direct investments or European investments, China is still lagging behind. On average, if you look at the whole region, China accounts for less than 5% of the region's total inflows. And the last point is related, well, to a discussion that is growing in Latin America, and is about the consequences of the trade relationship with China. According to many, this relationship has made local economies more fragile and more vulnerable to the fluctuations of the international markets. And so this is a point that show you that China growing presence in the region is, of course, not a linear or irreversible process. And so I've tried to summarize really quickly these points to give you an idea of the current state of the relationship between China and Latin America. But what I would like to do is to reflect on the relevance of the Latin American case for our discussion, for our debate. Actually, I think that the Latin American case can give us some insights about China strategy, and in particular, I think China's strategy in relation to the so-called global South, or what was once called the developing world. So I think from the Latin American case, one can argue that Beijing's approach has been highly pragmatic, in that China had from the very beginning very clear which were its goals in the region in terms of access to raw materials, finding new export markets or new financial outlets. But at the same time, China has also been very cautious, because it has been really careful in avoiding any type of confrontation or antagonizing the United States. And in all Chinese documents dedicated to the region, the emphasis is put on the concept of win-win, win-win diplomacy, or win-win cooperation. So this is important, I think, because it gives you an idea, particularly for the initial approach of China, of how it was pragmatic and also, I would say, smart in that it avoided any confrontation with the United States. And another point that I would like to emphasize is the idea of South-South cooperation, that again, this also with Xi Jinping has been an important topic in the partnership with Latin America. China has tried to promote its bilateral ties with Latin American countries on a peer-to-peer basis. China has often described itself as a developing country, and it has framed the cooperation with Latin American countries as part of this South-South cooperation project. And I think this is one of the key that explain Chinese success in diplomatic terms in the region, because this approach has met the consensus and the sympathies of many social and political forces and actors in the region. And well, the last point is still about the relation with the United States. As I was saying, China has never framed its presence in the region as a direct challenge to the United States or the US role in the hemisphere. At the same time, behind this approach, China has been able to target and attract those countries and those governments in particular in the region that were more detached, more discontent with Washington, or most dissatisfied with the existing international institution, particularly the international financial institution, which were considered part of or related to, of course, Washington's influence and power. So I think that in a way, China's strategy in the region can be said to have filled the void that the United States had left in Latin America during the last two decades, and it has been able to do that without provoking any direct confrontation with the United States. But this is, of course, another point, and part of my opinion is that the net result of China's strategy is probably a challenge to US leadership in the region. But I think it is important to reflect on how China has arrived to this point. And I don't know how much time I still have, but
not more than 1 minute.
Okay, no, it's just just a brief reflection on the Latin American side of the story, because it's the actual focus of my research. And I think it is interesting, again, to observe how Latin American countries have engaged with China, because among Western observers, I mean here from the United States in particular, but also in Europe, there is the tendency to overlap Latin American foreign policies with the political orientation of the leader or party in power. But I think that China has represented something more for Latin America, an alternative for export diversification, investment. And so I think the focus on the political or ideological variable is important, but it cannot explain it all. And this is, I think, a reflection also for everyone that is studying the international order, where we place the global south in the international order, and how much is international this international order. So this is the last point. Thank you.
So Professor Lucarelli, and then Professor Carati.
So hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the presentations. I appreciated them all. And it has been interesting to listen to you, although I'm sure that you would have had many more things to say on your research beyond the time that was given to you. So I dare asking some of the questions that were provoked by your presentations. To Lorenzo, it wasn't clear to me two things. And one is how these theories have been used. You mentioned classical realism, power transition theory, neoclassical realism, without, going too much into detail, but it was not that clear to me how you use these theories. So, well, I have an idea because I have read some of your work, but most of all, from a methodological point of view, you say, well, we want to test whether these theories work, and we select 4 areas of foreign policy and see how China behaves in these areas of foreign policy. So whether the behavior supports the expectation of neoclassical realism, in fact, in particular. But then the areas that you chose were already, a bias in your methodology, in your research. So in a sense, the way you shaped your methodology led probably to the conclusions that you reached. So I wonder whether you thought about this and whether you can convince me that this is not the case. Flavia? Flavia, in the case of your research, I was left with the impression that something was missing, and it looks as if Russia simply reacts to the behavior of the so-called West as if it was an inevitable type of response by Russia itself, because it perceives itself as a great power. And that could be applied as in realism to any power. It could be applied in the same way to India, it could be applied to China for the way you presented it here. While on the contrary, it's much more convincing to me if you combine this to an analysis of the domestic context within which this idea of self-perception as a great power is developed, because otherwise I don't see where is the constructivist component of your research. Perceptions have been analyzed by Jervis long ago without any need for constructivism. So I was wondering whether it wouldn't be useful for you to dig into role theory and explore some of the potentials of the different streams in role theory. Nicolò, as you know, I like your approach also because we have been writing together and you being the expert on Russia, but then, and you also being the expert on strategic culture. But my question is, what is the margin of transformation of a strategic culture? It seems as if this strategic culture of Russia is there since a long time. It's based on history, on culture, on geographic position. So where is the dimension of transformation through social interaction? Again, this constructivist component of strategic culture. And to Carlo, I'm not an expert at all, neither on Latin America nor on China, but my interest would go if you explore what China's role in Latin America in the direction of looking at the impact on the liberal order. My first expectation would be to see whether the presence of China is transforming regional multilateralism or regional integration processes. That is one of the achievements of the liberal order in Latin America. So more than the competition with the US, I would look for this dimension of regional integration and regional multilateralism. For how weak it can be, it's still there. And I also think it's very important what you say about the global South, which, however, despite the rhetoric that India and some other Southern countries have put on it, I think it has remained very much written, I mean, in documents and rhetoric. Thank you.
Professor Carati, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you both to the organizer and to the presenters for their presentations, their insights on such current, issues on world politics. I had actually three brief remarks, but Sonia anticipated a bit one of them. They are for the presentations of Lorenzo, Flavia, and Nicolò. Starting from Lorenzo, well, I agree with the first part of your presentation when you argued that probably power transition theory, realism, classical and neoclassical realism have some shortcomings, or probably they are not equipped to really grasp the current China's foreign policy or its revisionist side. I'm less convinced about the arguments you presented in the second half of your speech. Probably, I think you are correct. China in the recent years has been very cautious, very wary. Self-restraint has been one of the main drivers of China's foreign policy, but probably is too much, at least to me, to expect from China a radical revisionist comparable with the Nazi Germany revisionism in the 30s. Obviously, I agree with you, I agree with Morgenthau and many others saying that the Nazi Germany is probably one of the purest empirical cases of radical revolutionary revisionism. That's correct. But I'm not convinced that we should expect from China now a similar behavior in the international arena, for many reasons. But there are many superficial reasons. Well, the historical contexts are different. Nazi Germany and China are driven by two different opposite ideologies. But the main point is power. We cannot compare the dissatisfaction of Nazi Germany with the current China's dissatisfaction, given the international distribution of power in the 30s and nowadays. Even though in decline, the US are particularly threatening today, and probably are still the most powerful global power in the world. You correctly say that China has been very cautious in using its military might against the Philippines or vis-a-vis Korea. That's correct. But China is not afraid of Korea. China is not afraid of the Philippines. China is afraid of the Americans in the Philippines or the Americans in Korea. China is afraid about the reaction, the possible US reaction, coming from an aggressive or just an assertive foreign policy in those regions. So probably drawing a comparison or using too much Nazi Germany as a point of reference for nowadays China's foreign policy, in my view, is probably too much. Coming to Flavia, Sonia anticipated probably the main argument. My impression is that you focused your empirical analysis about the Russian dissatisfaction on what the West is doing. It is clear what from NATO expansions, the leadership of NATO or the US-led order in carrying out interventions, in supporting the Orange revolutions and so on. Those are Western actions. But to measure the Russian dissatisfaction, we need to measure the reactions of Russia to those policies. And finally, final remark to Nicolò. I really appreciated your presentation. I have just a brief remark on one of your last comments. You stated at the end that, well, we cannot see the US-led international order disentangled from liberalism, because this does not make sense or seems to be impossible in a way. Well, I would be more cautious about that. That's true for the US foreign policies in the 90s and probably in the following decade. But recently, the US foreign policy community, and within the foreign policy community, there is a debate calling for a restraint in the US global foreign policy. If you read the last book of John Mersheimer, The Great Delusion, is a case in favor of disentangle US foreign policy from liberalism, because according to Mersheimer, liberalism, when it goes abroad, it creates a lot of troubles. So Stephen Walt, in his book, The Hell of Good Intentions, more or less suggest the same argument. I mean, both within the practitioners debate and in IR debates in the US, there is a growing number of scholars, practitioners arguing in precisely against the idea to pursue in this global liberal agenda. And their argument is essentially that one. We have to disentangle the liberal ideology from the US global leadership, or we have to stop using liberal ideals as the main ingredients of the US foreign policy. So I agree partially with you, but I would be more cautious, and I would give space in your argument to this growing dissatisfaction within the US foreign policy community, arguing precisely in favor of a disentanglement from liberalism and the US global role.
what I say to the four presenters is that they use the word order as if there is no need of sharing a meaning for this word, or to say, sharing a meaning of the concept of order. And in their presentation, it's not always been very clear whether they are talking about political order. And political order is the fact that in a political system, the authorities make some laws and policies, and there is order because the subjects comply with these laws and policies. There is order inside the state because the legislators and the government make some laws and policies, and the citizens in the majority comply with it. I think this concept should be used also in making a political analysis of international relations or the world system. Now, to be short, of course, we use the word liberal order. I mean, it's a wrong term. Is the world political order, and there is an authority in this political system that make the policies that have as their result order. That's to say, the fact that prevalently all the countries or the majority of the countries comply with the policies. Of course, we live in a time of delegitimation of the world policies made after the Second World War. I mean, the main policies, the financial, the trade, the security, and the colonization policies. Therefore, we underestimate the need for order and the fact that the states need some sharing of policies and international law in order to have order, because in order they have the conditions for having peaceful relations, and the government in the states have the conditions for making domestic policies and domestic politics. So this said, I would invite the four to, in their research, first of all, to define what they mean when they say order. Not simply the fact that the United States can use their resources the United States and the Western countries have. The order is the outcome of the fact that the policies are abide by the state or not abided. And therefore the constants are those, well, dissatisfied. And I go to the first speaker, the first presentations. Organsky was, of course, in the 50s, a genius in thinking about China as the rising global or world power, because in the 50s when he wrote the book, we know everybody was thinking of bipolarism, United States and Soviet Union. For sure, today we have a demonstration of how Organskys were right, because China has risen to in the hierarchy and is close to be a participant in the world order, because China is complying with the policies of the existing world order. That's to say, in the United Nations, in the International Monetary Fund, in the World Trade, China sustain this policy-making institution to make policies, and this order made by these policies is good to China, and is for this reason that we have strong hardship in understanding where China is today. Is a contestant, a delegitimizer, is instead fully complying with the existing major world policies. I have an answer, but of course this would be too much long. But this applies to China as well as to Russia, and the other two papers or presentations are very good, but yet I see also in these two presentations the fact that they say miss the parameter for assessing how much contestant or delegitimizer is Russia, because they do not go straight in what policy Russia is contesting on trade, on security, on sovereignty, on the new world policy of climate change, and so on. So I appreciate very much the definition of the self-perception of Russia, right? But this self-perception is played in world politics, is played in contesting the order. Then this self-perception must be analyzed in its potentiality for creating a group or a coalition of countries sharing the view of Russia. Otherwise, Russia is not a contestant. If simply is dissatisfied, well, many citizens within the state are dissatisfied, they break the laws, but this doesn't change very much the order within the states. Same at the world level. And also the presentation by Nicolò has this perspective. Russia is complying with many public law policies, many world public policies. At the same time, sometimes Russia breaks some policies. So is I say frequently is a declaratory compliance by Russia. This could be a theme of analysis, because as has been said, Russia does not break frequently the rule, at least in the foreign policy declaration. But then empirically, you have to test whether really Russia comply with some sovereignty, territorial security rules of the world political system. Carlo, I was in a panel with Carlo 2 years ago. I just for kidding, I don't know why he continues to study China and Latin America. It seems quite a static theme. I'm joking a little, of course, there are some interesting aspects. But maybe, of course, you compare the policy of China towards single countries, towards the Latin American region. Why not compare also the policy of China towards Latin America and the policy of China towards another group or region in the world political system, to understand whether, I mean, you underlined that China has no the objective of contesting United States. Therefore, I try the consequence that China has economic interest, that to say investment interest, is only this because, well, certainly you can put this hypothesis and demonstrate that China is doing what it's doing in Latin America only because want to invest some money. There are really advantage, benefits, profit in investing in Latin America more than in other regions. Well, okay, that's my contribution.
So I presented a very empirical, theoretical thing to start with. So I just present that the theory is probably not so well equipped to deal with today's China. But still, I believe the power transition could be useful if in some way refined. And my refinement is basically, but I am at an early stage of my research, but my refinement would be that we need to use continuum and not thresholds and not categories, both for power and dissatisfaction. So if you use continuum, and this is something that power transition does not do so much, we will see that there are many levels of dissatisfactions and so many different degrees of these independent variable that PTT uses to explain revisionism. So probably we would say, and this is for Andreas Kayadi's question. This is probably what explains today's China differently from the Nazi Germany, and I totally agree with you. So probably China today is not as much dissatisfied as Nazi Germany was back in the days, because it benefited from the existing conditions.
Well, starting from the considering the domestic variable, of course, that I consider domestic variable in my dissertation, as I adopt constructivist approach, and the constructivist approach itself suggests that to look at domestic variable in order to avoid the black boxing problem of the state. About the role theory, no, I didn't consider role theory in my dissertation, as I prefer adopting a different type of approach and describing Russia and China as status seeker states, according to the approach elaborated by Larson and Shevchenko, that also try to combine the social approaches of IR theory, like constructivism, with social identity theories and indeed with social psychology. That is one of the points that indeed I think lead me to a very different result, if not an opposite result, if compare my research finding with that of Nicolò, because Nicolò and his dissertation by saying that contestation is about liberalism and not about contesting the West. Right, in my dissertation, the point is that contestation is addressed against the West that turned liberalism into a way for protecting its hegemony, and in this way was unable to include other power, namely rising power, within the order, and this created a crisis of legitimacy of the current institution and practices.
So very briefly, Sonia was asking what are the margins of transformations of Russia's strategic culture or strategic culture in general. So if one takes a strategic cultural approach, one takes a long-term approach, an approach of longue durée. So to take a strategic culture approach implies that you are searching for continuities rather than discontinuities. So culture is mainly static. It changes only, again, in the long term. Of course, doesn't mean that the culture never changes. We know that very well at the sub-state level, in our daily lives, at the more social, non-international relations field. Russia's strategic culture, after a break from the Soviet experience during the 1990s, started emerging in the 2000s and then consolidated around 2008. And I would argue that since 2008 until today, broad and large, the main, deepest, more structural tenets of Russia's strategic culture have remained unaltered. Of course, there have been superficial adaptations, but that is not tantamount to strategic cultural change. Change will be possible either in a revolutionary way with elite change, and I'm not talking about leaders change. If we just cut the head of Putin, Russia's strategic culture, Russia's way of behaving on the international stage will not change. What I mean with elite change is indeed the just disappearance of the vast majority, or not the totality, of the decision makers in Russia. Then, of course, there's also a generational factor. In the very long term, Russia's strategic culture will adapt to the experiences it is undergoing by including so-called lessons learned within its cognitive frame. But of course, again, this will be a long-term process.
Just 1 minute, and well, thanks to all for the comments and questions. Well, just one brief word on Professor Lucarelli's idea and suggestion about measuring China's impact in the region, looking at how regionalism in Latin America has been affected. I think this is, I mean, it is complicated, but it might be really useful. Honestly, I think that the impact, it will be difficult to measure, in that, as you were saying, the crisis, well, the crisis and the proliferation of regional organization in Latin America were probably related to China's rise, but also due mostly to internal dynamics in the region. But I think it is interesting, only one thing about China, that China in a first stage in approaching the region have tried to engage with the existing institutions. It became a permanent observer at the OAS, or it joined the Inter-American Development Banks. Then, in particular with Xi Jinping, it has tried to set up its own institutions. But most of these institutions were also related to specific governments, for example, Lula and Brazil, just to cite one. And the fortune of those institutions has been, of course, declining after some leaders in the region, such as Lula, disappeared from the scene. But maybe this is already a reply or an answer in itself, the fact that China's initiatives on that front haven't been very successful. And I also agree with the skepticism about the label Global South. I have employed it because it's a new word for something that was already in the literature, or like developing word. But I think the issues that underline that label are important, because are different from those that we, for example, in Europe, but also in the United States, think about when we think about the international order, because are not about, or not only about values or institutions, but more about development and more about power asymmetries also.